Hi YouTube! For this orchestral mixing tip, I'd like to share the importance of taking the time to perform all of your individual tracks one by one, and then also taking the time to solo them one by one, and turn down the volume on your speakers, listen at a low volume, and pay close attention to the realism of your performance and the realism of the sample library that you're using. So let's talk about performance stuff first. This is the final movement in a large symphony project I recently released, and here are the strings legato. For the individual notes, I did not perform the notes one by one, but I programmed these during the composition, arrangement, orchestration point of my project. Then after that, I'd load in my samples, and then I'd initiate playback, and then use my MIDI controller to do the modulation of all of these string passages. So you can see all of this part here was performed by me on my MIDI keyboard using the modulation wheel. So I do that for every single part of all the strings, and I do that for every single instrument that needed it. So for example, like a choir did modulation wheel there. For all of the brass, same thing. I'd program the notes, but then I'd use the modulation wheel on my keyboard to perform the trumpets and the horns and trombones and such. Moving down to the performance of percussion, let's use this darbuka for an example. This is a Hans Zimmer percussion darbuka, and what I did for all of my percussion tracks is first I programmed them all, getting them really close to how I wanted them to sound, and then I'd create a new track, plug in my MIDI keyboard, initiate playback so I could hear my darbuka going, and then I'd rock out on my MIDI keyboard, bash away. I don't have a great MIDI keyboard at all, so I just kind of comfortably bash on it like I'm wailing on a darbuka, you know. So that, and then once I'm finished with my performance, I'd swap in my performance track for my programming track. If you're pressed for time and you can't perform all these percussions things individually, you could, in Logic at least, you can highlight, do functions, MIDI transform, humanize, and you can humanize your programmed passage, which helps a little bit for sure. It's not as great as performing it, but it's still pretty cool. So next, let's talk about the importance of soloing and listening back at a low volume. So let's pretend again like you just performed your violas, you're going to solo this track, turn down the volume on your speakers and listen at a low volume. And what I like to do is I like to pretend there's like a friend or a sibling standing right next to me who's a pretty critical person, and I just like pretend to ask them, hey, does this sound realistic to you? You kind of have to exit your own mindset and pretend like you're listening with fresh ears, like you've never heard it before. And then you can be genuine and honest with yourself and go, you know what, this performance doesn't sound good enough, or you know what, this sample sounds fake. I've definitely had to swap out samples over the years. You know, I've invested in a lot of string libraries over the years, and there's certain ones that years ago I thought they sounded great, but as my ears developed over time, I listen to them now and I'm like, wow, that sounds really fake, and I just don't use them anymore, unfortunately, and so I have to go and do some research and maybe invest in a new string library or something like that. So yeah, that's pretty much the tip. Once you do that, all the little details of everything you do on every single one of these tracks, it will help each track stand its own. You know, if it was a cello performing a solo performance, it would stand really strong by itself, and then together as a whole, with everything going at once, it's going to make your whole orchestration sound spectacular. All right, hopefully this has been helpful.